I'm delighted to welcome you to this very exciting session with our special US guests, Nathan Cummings and Brian Crimmins, in what I believe is the first Australian live stream event. And we're so excited to bring Nathan and Brian to you, who will shortly be in conversation with very close friend of the forum, Dr. Wendy Scaife. I'd like to start the session by acknowledging the traditional owners and pay our collective respects to elders past and present on the land and waters of Australia and New Zealand, and to acknowledge the wisdom and sovereignty of all First Nations people. By way of a very quick background, I had the opportunity of meeting Nathan recently at the Giving Institute Forum, and after one of the plenary sessions, Nathan very kindly gave me a copy of his fantastic book, The Generosity Crisis, which I started reading on the plane home, and very quickly realized that the global trends that Nathan, Brian, and Micah were addressing are very relevant in Australia. My next call was to Wendy Scaife just to check that, and Wendy verified that very quickly. And we then reached out, to Nathan and Brian to tee this up. So a little bit of a background of how we're going to run this forum, and then we'll get the show on the road. I will shortly be calling on Ryan Ginghard, Head of Advancement at the Australian National University, to introduce the session. Ryan, in addition to his busy day job at ANU, is the author of, two books, Future Philanthropy, and one which is just about to be launched entitled The Not-for-Profit Moneyball, and one which I'm very looking forward to reading. So thank you in advance, Ryan, and I will hand to you in a moment. Ryan will then introduce the conversation with Wendy, Nathan, and Brian. We will then, as we usually do, allow some time for Q&A and discussion, which is often the richest part of the call. However, time is limited, and I'll make sure that we end and close at 9 o'clock sharp. And I'll be asking our other good friend of the forum, Kristen Lark, CEO of the Funding Network, to propose a vote of thanks at the end. So just before we kick off, let me just thank our event partners, as I always do.
You're on mute.
Lawrence, you've muted.
Sorry, everybody.
It stopped when you said, let me thank our event partners.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Don't know how that happened, but I'll just whip through thanking our event partners again. So that's Come Together, the ENFP community at HLB Man Judd, Fundraising Institute of Australia, Focus Fundraising, Fundraising Research and Consulting, Philanthropy Australia, thank you, and the Funding Network. So my job is now done, and I will hand to Ryan to say a few words and introduce the session. So over to you, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. And it's always good to get an introduction to be the person that introduces. So I'm going to play that role of intellectual fifth wheel, as it were. Just wanted to kick off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I wanted to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to any First Nations people joining us today. Also wanted to just say thank you to, all my friends, peers, change makers that are in the room today, coming together to hear from such revered thought leaders in the space in what is their kind of first foray onto Australian airwaves in an exclusive capacity. It's an exciting time, and you know what, we're in an exciting moment right now. So in terms of framing this, there's two prominent things that everyone in this room should be aware of at the moment. One is the National Commission inquiry into philanthropy. We're very much trying to build the infrastructure and I guess legislation that will help the government double philanthropy by 2030. So that's a big one. I believe that the first report will be due down in November, which will include a number of recommendations for consultation. So that's one exciting time. The other one was the Scanlon Foundation this week released its social cohesion index. That was in conjunction with the Australian National University. And one thing that is very prevalent and I think kind of sets up this conversation about a generosity crisis is that every single social component of that, volunteering, giving, being part of a social group was down, and it was down to numbers of up to 35%. We definitely are in a crisis. So this book really came at an opportune time. It really was one of my books of the year last year. It reset my thinking on a lot of things because I write 10 years into the future. I'm in a very, very niche spot. So reading the work of Brian and Nathan really grounded me in what our foundations are and how we actually have that future. So without further ado, I'll introduce folks for this really engaging back and forth. I want to kick off with my bellwether for philanthropy here in Australia, and that's Dr. Wendy Scaife. She's now the Adjunct Associate Professor, but obviously you will know her from leading the Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Non-Profit Studies most recently. She's fantastic, and she's definitely going to be a great guide here. And of course, Brian and Nathan, the stars of the show, they're everywhere at the moment. I'll let them go into kind of their work, but look at this as the generosity crisis when you get a copy and you start reading it. They really deconstruct where we're at the moment, and they really give tangible ways for us and our organisations to move forward and start to repair the social fabric of our society, one that has people in the system that need our help more than ever. So thanks for the time to introduce, and I really look forward to the conversation, as I'm sure you will do too. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Ryan, and welcome everybody. What a great way to start the day, thinking about the future and with a couple of global thought leaders in our space to challenge us and make our day finish differently, because we hopefully after this time will be thinking differently. So again, I too will acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we're meeting, for me, the Turrbal and the Yugara people here in Brisbane, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I guess that we've had a brief intro there from Brian for our speakers, but if I can just firstly point you to the bio, because these are two really interesting people, and I think people's trajectories and what they've focused on tells you so much about authors of a book. But just very quickly, so Nathan Chappell is of course the foremost authority perhaps on AI and philanthropy, and his day job hangs out as Senior VP of donor donor search. I was going to say donor search AI, and so very, very important that you have a look at that organisation as well. And he also gave the first TEDx talk on the topic of artificial intelligence and the future of generosity in 2018. So we're 5 years in, but I think for a lot of us, we're just starting to hear about this. Brian, of course, Brian Crimmins, is also a global leader in social impact. And if you haven't come across the organisation Changing Our World, again, a treat in store and something that you should be having a look at in those moments on your phone. And of course, an organisation that works on both the corporate side and on the non-profit side in terms of how we can go about changing our world, and how important is that in terms of where the power bases are these days. So I guess I'm going to speak very little, which is unusual for me, and I haven't started off well on that to start. But anyway, I'm the glue here. We're here to hear these fantastic people who have really focused on this, and I guess that's where my first question comes from. So why this book, why this topic, and why you and your co-author to write this?
Nathan, you want to go first? Or you want me to jump in?
I'm happy to tell our love story first, Brian. Jokingly, this is one of those things that I think I'll speak for Brian on this part. I don't think any of us thought when we first met that we would that we were either had planned to publish a book or let alone planning to publish a book together. But I think by the way the universe works brought us together many years ago when I was working at a cancer hospital and he was working at Changing Our World. And it was one of those situations that when you find someone coming from New York and I'm in California, that we were building some really innovative programs together and the work was, 8 to 5, and then we would spend, 5 to 10 o'clock at night talking about, all the world's problems. And, when you meet those people, you're like, man, if we just had more time, we could solve all the world's problems. And, this continued for several years. Like we would, like if I would be in New York or he'd be in California, we'd be like, let's get dinner, and we'd talk. And at the end of the day, I think both of us from very different lenses, we're looking at, a confluence of different things happening where essentially, Giving USA was in the US was reporting that generosity was at all-time high. Yet myself as a practitioner knew the reality was that I was asked to raise more money from less people every year. And we were raising more money from less people. And 20 years of doing that it makes you kind of wonder, like, at what point does this end? And so I know we'll peel back the onion and get a little bit deeper on this, but it really came, from my opinion, from this fascination, and not even fascination, a more of a responsibility, is to, highlight, truly where we were at, and then finding out that we weren't alone. Canada and the UK and Australia also were finding similar declines in charitable participation, that someone needed to just sound the alarm. And, Brian and I often joke that you don't write a book called The Generosity Crisis to make friends. I don't know how Lawrence got through it on the airplane, because we often hear that the first 100 pages are somewhat depressing. But we always have to reassure people that once you get past the first 100 pages, that actually it's a very optimistic book. But we did feel like it was an imperative to say, look, let's take stock of where we're at in the confluence of circumstances that led us here, before we were going to start and try to imagine a different future. And so that's essentially my version of the origin story. I'll be curious to see what Brian says.
No, Nathan, you said it really well. And Nathan was seeing it in his, cancer hospital. I, as a consultant, was seeing it in bouncing around to all of our clients on the nonprofit side. And they all felt, this is going back now, as Nathan said, probably 6, 7, 10 years. It was interesting to hear those conversations in isolation, because many people were speaking as if it was just their organization that was having this trouble, less donors, coming to the floor. And it was not, the more you leave and hop on a plane and the more you think about these things, you realize that there was something happening and something brewing. And so, Wendy, one last thing I'll add to that is that Nathan actually, at a conference we were together at in New York, he called out to the audience of practitioners that somebody needs to write this book. And we thought for sure somebody would do it besides us. And then it got to the point where we felt like, what, if no one else is going to do it, we have to do it, whether we make friends or not. And thankfully we are 10 months into this, and I think we're making some friends around as we go around. So hopefully that's for everyone's benefit, to learn how to reverse the trends that we're all seeing.
Excellent. And how exciting that, the networking that we do in our space can create something that, creates a spark for the world, and also shines a spotlight on a real problem, I would say, in Australia as well, that, we've seen 40-year lows in terms of giving participation. So this is a problem, but we blithely go on with our lives and try and find a new fundraising technique and put it under the carpet a bit. So like that your book is not allowing anybody to put it under the carpet. What has led to this crisis in generosity, in your view, in your research?
Yeah, well, Brian and I could take it from two different lenses, which we do quite a bit of public speaking together. I think when we categorize, the confluence of circumstances, they're both internal and external, like things that we've done to ourselves as an industry, and then things in how the world has changed and shifted that are causing, both that confluence to happen. I mean, I'll start by, some just highlighting a couple of the internal things, but you kind of have to read the book to get to the level of detail when we really unpack those. I think it's important to talk about what we're talking about in terms of generosity, and and to be very clear, that we're actually in the book saying that maybe there is no crisis of generosity, but that people are essentially changing in how they express their generosity. So point of fact is that organizations like GoFundMe process 1 transaction per second 24/7, showing that people are wanting to make a difference. What's changed in the generosity crisis in our book is really related to charitable giving through a traditional 501c3 organization. Now, of course, there are a lot more options now to express that generosity, which we'll kind of unpack. Like in Australia, people are opting out of that traditional method of giving to a nonprofit, which is it's concerning for lots of different reasons, because of the type of autonomous organization that they create and the accountability that nonprofits have to the stakeholders. But it is to say that people still want to make a difference, that somehow nonprofits are no longer as the only or preferred method by which you express your generosity. So meaning that if I give to an organization, is that charity helping amplify my generosity, or they become a barrier to it if they made it more challenging to give? So when we talk about the internal things, and just to highlight, I think part of it is what I was a contributor toward most of my career, and I spent 20 years fundraising, several $1 billion under my team and my watch throughout my career, was kind of this unrelenting belief that more is better. That, essentially, like, and I won't say where I worked when this phrase came up, but that we were building a better mousetrap, that we were getting better at using data technology to essentially, what's implied there is like trick donors into giving. And now I started fundraising before there was really any technology. I mean, literally had a Rolodex, like a spinning Rolodex, where I'd have to go through and like, look people up in the card and, call them and actually on the telephone and have lunch with them in person at a restaurant. And, it's so crazy, before GuideStar was around even, and where there was any of that, it was that philanthropy was largely for pretty much forever prior to that based on trust. It was based on my character, my values, the trust that an individual had that I was going to receive their money and put it into the best usable place, and then report back on that. And when we fast forward really a short period of time, 20 years, we have moved into a position where giving is highly transactional, that technology, for all its great ability to create efficiencies, has moved the pendulum so far that I think for a lot of ways, donors feel like they are an ATM machine. They're a transaction to be had. And I would say for a majority of my career, it was more about this idea. I think we're getting unmuted from someone. Was that we were looking for more donors at any cost. And if donor acquisition was going down, we'd just spend more money. And to your point of like kind of pushing stuff under the rug, we knew that those weren't good donors. Like, we knew that they were only being retained at like 19% on average, but incrementally, a few of them would stay with us. And so we were essentially playing that game. So all that to say, there is a confluence of a lot of other internal things, like nonprofits don't invest in research and development. Very, 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 I've only met one organization that has a philanthropic R&D budget. They are, that aversion to risk, that, that idea that, we just, can continue to do more and not better. And so I'll leave it at that, but that's, I think the end result of all those are the same, is that we've ended up creating this paradigm that organizations, I think, have equated giving with transactions and generosity with wealth. That, the end result is that organizations like, this other stuff doesn't work, let's just go after the wealthy people. And that's been kind of the bed that has been made for most nonprofits kind of chasing that dream.
And Wendy, I'll add we talked about internal and external. From an external standpoint, the environment, and we've said this word now multiple times already, but we're living in all of our societies now where happiness is at the lowest points. Trust is, Ryan touched on this, I think, in the beginning. Trust is at an all-time low. So those are just some factors that are just not helpful when you're trying to raise money. And so I just want to point that out. The main thing I want to touch on is when we were writing the book, there was something that really struck Nathan and I, which was this notion that we called in the book the competition for connection. And what I really want to hit on about this is a little bit of a pulling up from what Nathan talked about, people's abilities now to be generous in different ways. Well, one of those things that's been happening for 15 years or so is to watch brands and companies, and we consult with Fortune 10, Fortune 200, Fortune 500. So I mean these comments with a lot of respect because I get to work with some of them, but they have positioned their reason for being. They've positioned their products in such a way that there's often, if you truly look at Patagonia, you look at some of the Ben & Jerry's, and these are just the highest examples of companies who have been doing it for a long time. If you look at their mission statement, you look at their value statements, I would challenge you to cover up their logo and read them. And honestly, if you've been in this industry a long enough time, like I have, you would think, my gosh, that was once the wording of just a not-for-profit, that they're here to, make the world a better place. They're here to clean up society, to clean up the environment. And so they have been very shrewd, knowing that they're competing for our connection, they're competing for our mind share, they're competing for our wallet share, and they've gotten very effective at it. And I'm not saying they're doing it. Yes, there's a marketing component, but in some respects, I'll stay on the Patagonia line of thinking. They are doing some great work in the environmental space. And so what that has created now is, I think there was a statistic that says the younger generation, I think under the age of 25, 57% of them in a recent survey said that they believed that for-profits and brands are more likely to solve societal issues now than non-profits. So think about that mind shift from my parent. I'm the youngest of 9 kids, so my folks are a little bit older, but their generation, which was the moral high ground, the place you went to do good in society, was a nonprofit. It's gotten very crowded in the messaging and actually who's delivering the good work on that area.
Wow, so many points there. And I guess both of you have touched on, what we misguided academics will call disintermediation. So in other words, cutting out the middleman, cutting out the charities that have been doing this a long time, that are kind of like have got the knowledge of a government department on their particular issue. They know it well, and have been doing it usually for quite a time. And so the impact of that, the generosity being expended in a different way, and you are putting it down, of course, to things like this, well, if you like, crisis of connection, or that competition for connection, and highlighting that, once again, there are things that sectors can learn from one another. One of them, from our point of view, being, of course, how best to create that sense of belonging and be able to personalise and reach out, as our corporate partners have been doing, using a lot of technology in particular. And I guess the other thing I wanted to highlight from what you were saying, just to kind of draw out some threads in such a rich conversation, trust. Adrian Sargent, who everybody knows, and a wonderful researcher in this area, is always on about the fact that we don't know what creates donor loyalty, and the information is there. It's satisfaction, commitment, and trust, and we know the tools to create those, but we actually don't pay attention to the evidence. So I'm excited that you are talking about some of the ways that we can maybe get back to building that sense of belonging, building that greater trust, and I guess. One of the other things that I wanted to just highlight, some beautiful phrases coming from you, Nathan, conflating generosity with wealth. There's so much to unpack just in that. So if I kind of move forward, then I'd just like to revisit very quickly this nexus between technology and philanthropy, and whether it's a friend or a foe, because it's an area that both of you are across, and then move into the hope part of your book. In other words, what are you suggesting? Okay, so just firstly, then, the nexus between giving, generosity, and technology. Friend, foe, both?
So I'm happy to go first. And thanks for pointing this out. I mean, we often tell people when we're doing a workshop or something that it's going to feel like we're crashing the airplane, but I promise you that we we actually pull up and we get out of this, the crash. The reality is when we were writing the book, Brian and I had reserved a chapter that was, our hope was that we were going to find the replacement for what was a scalable solution to reversing the generosity crisis. That through all of our conversations and like several years of planning and debating and discussing, is that when we looked at like the decline in religious participation and the divisiveness and the other ways of giving and all that, that there was going to be some scalable solution that we'd highlight. And to be honest, that we never found it. We never wrote that chapter. But it'll be interesting to see how Brian responds to this. I'm obviously pretty biased in this. I believe in the application of responsible AI to help nonprofits create a precision and personalization, and truly think that at this day and age that AI, again, always using the word responsibly ahead of it, is the only scalable solution that even has a chance of reversing these trends. So in ways that really could have never been done before. I started working in AI in 2017, our first data science project was profound in the sense that, you know, for my entire career, we had always measured each person either based on crudely how wealthy they were, and at the very most, you know, maybe 12 other data points. And when we started using machine learning and deep learning, we learned that, well, not surprising, people are much more complicated than 12 data points. Using 1,000 data points, we get a little bit better of a glimpse and a more holistic and less biased glimpse on what does this person actually do, and what is their connection to the organization. And so we've really pioneered a lot of the work that has gone around this idea that giving generosity is a manifestation of that connection, like how well they know you and how deep that connection is. And then we figured out ways to measure that connection without using their wealth. So I'm a big believer that used responsibly, and that means prioritizing, you know, privacy, security, ethics, basically trust, prioritizing trust between an organization and their donors. That technology can be a tremendous force for good. At the same time, with a healthy dose of caution that used irresponsibly, it could absolutely accelerate and exacerbate the generosity crisis. So today, you know, on any given day, I spend probably more time talking about responsible AI than I do whether or not, you know, AI is something you should do. Brian, you might have a different lens on that.
No, I know. I mean, being your co-pilot for 2 years on this journey, I've only thing I'll add is that having seen your work firsthand with my clients, with some other organizations, the thing that everything you said, I found I had to go on that journey. You know, Wendy, you made a comment earlier, like that Nathan's been in this space for 6-7 years now, and for many of us, I still find myself learning it, and I find myself stumbling a bit and not understanding some of the terms. But he's been my guide through all of this, and to see the one thing I will layer on to what he talked about was that the ability for an organization to understand the connection, because the connection is what we believe truly leads to the money, as he said, and the support. But to do it in a way that you understand how the person is either coming closer or moving further away in real time from the organization based on all the data points, to me is the single biggest change that I've seen as it relates to the consulting of the strategies, of the tactics that we're recommending. And it is, I've been doing this for 24 years now, and in the last 18, 24 months, as I said, working with Nathan, this has been the biggest eye-opener of how we can actually get to doing things differently.
Wow, again, some amazing words and themes coming through. That word profound, a scalable solution, perhaps the only solution to what is a deep-seated, robust challenge is what you're explaining to us, and what the data has been telling us now for certainly in the giving data for at least a decade. And so I guess, and also religious participation. I know I was presenting with a Dutch researcher in Europe one time, and his presentation was about the graph that showed the decline in religious participation and the decline in giving, which was absolutely identical. So this connection, belonging, all of those things. I guess I'm excited that again, you know, that 1,000 data points. Wow, I remember the 7 faces of philanthropy. You know, 1,000. We are multiply better. I guess and prioritizing trust and highlighting ethics, which I think has always been our space, our sector's space, our sector's ability. So based on all of that, tell me how this works in practice. What are organisations doing differently? What are fundraisers doing differently? Boards, funders, what's the implications to make this work?
Yeah, I'll jump in and get us started here on this one. The first thing I'll say that and this has been, this was not something I fully admit that I had much clarity around when we wrote the book. It was only through getting conversations like this and getting in front of our audiences that a phrase, a thought process, a strategy really came very clear to mind. And that is that the generosity crisis is no longer, or nor is it, a development or a fundraising issue. It's actually an organizational issue. And because if you understand what our book's about, I think what we really, and again, I don't know if I had the clarity on this until after we published it, that this is really to do this right, to begin to reverse the generosity crisis. It's not a development challenge or an issue, it's an organization. And I think by that, 2 main things come to mind. One, the term radical connection is something that we talk about in the book. And for us, it's not a profound word or words, but it was something we had to give it a new name, give it a new label, moving it away from association or connection to because that doesn't, it's not enough anymore. With the amount of information we're all getting, the number of emails, the number of advertisements, how much we're on social media, the connection and affiliation, it just doesn't work anymore. You're going to have very transient donors. We're going to be in the situation we're in. The radical connection is a much deeper understanding. I personally like, if I could choose one aspect, I like to say radical connection is achieved when I know you and you know me. And so, Wendy, a long way of saying, or a roundabout way of saying, the strategies we're beginning to talk about with our organizations is, one, this has to be an organizational issue. We have to have everyone with their antenna up, thinking radical connections, thinking differently, thinking beyond just the old ways of doing things. That's number one. Number two, one thing we like to pose as a question to larger audiences, Nathan and I, is that if you had to force yourself, and I mean absolutely force yourself, to think of strategies through the lens of relationships and not money, what would you be doing differently today? And it's fascinating running workshops and getting in front of audiences as people. And you know what I love about that question, and what I love even more about the responses, is for all of us who are in this sector and care deeply about it, you start to see the passion again. You start to see that excitement, and people have said to us, oh, this is what I instinctually know we should be doing. This is why I got into the business. And so, and Wendy, maybe I'm staying at too high of a level for the question, but for each of their clients, it really starts to manifest differently, though, how they're going about it. But I think it's being true to who they are. I think it's being authentic. It's being transparent. It's being all the things we truly know to bring people along in a radically connected way versus just a connection or affiliation way. Quite frankly, similar to Nathan's comment about AI and technology, I've become a bigger believer that the way we talked about it in the book is the only way for an organizations. And I loved your line earlier. There's a lot to learn from other industries, and this is what the brands and the companies have known longer than we did. And let's be honest, they have bigger R&Ds and technologies. But it's why some of these brands have emerged and are selling, because they know us intimately, and whether we know it or not. And I don't think we're going to be able to ever compete at that scale, but we're closer now than we've ever been, thanks to the use of AI and technology and what we can do. And so, again, high level, and I'll let Nathan jump in and give his spin on this or challenge anything I've said. But a lot of it has to do with that it's an organizational issue, and we almost have to stop, rethink it from a different lens. And I think from that, strategies will emerge for your organization in the right way.
Yeah, I'll only just add to that. I mean, obviously, Brian and I, we do this a lot. We're very aligned in our thinking on this, so it'd be hard pressed to find us to disagree. I think there are things that we wrote about in the book that we had known through practice that we thought, yeah, this is, it's a philosophical mind shift of like less is more, essentially. Like this is like, get away from this more is more kind of mentality. Get back to the things that you know what you're doing. And people instinctually would come to me like, hey, this is like good old fashioned major gift work. It's like, yeah, how it used to be. The reality is, if you look at the math, finding, and prioritizing donors based on lifetime value is around 16 times higher than a person that's going to give episodically or just, single donation. I think that first part is like realizing, like, take stock of what you think connection means in your organization and, reimagine that, because it's not working. Like, we know what happens if you don't change. Like the trajectory at any given point, we didn't share this, but there's been a 16% decline in charitable participation in the US in the last 20 years. It's the least amount of math I've had to do in a really long time to realize that straight line ends in 49 years if nothing changes. So what you're doing doesn't work. That's the biggest shift. And when Brian and I are doing workshops or having conversations with organizations, like, just the willingness to challenge your assumptions and biases is a good start. But what the epiphanies have been for me, and that part of Brian saying it's an organizational change, not a development problem, have really come since we wrote the book. And we've had thousands of conversations and frankly, lots of very willing partners that say, like, I totally believe this. I want to get back to the way it was, like, in terms of like relationship first and not just this crazy, hamster wheel. But every time we've realized since then, it always comes back to the board. And it comes back to the board in the sense of, how is your organization evaluated? How is success evaluated? So if I'm a chief development officer, and essentially I am evaluated every year whether or not I fill the leaky bucket. So I only keep my job if I fill that annual bucket of revenue. then I'm only going to prioritize the low-hanging fruit. I'm only going to prioritize essentially wealthy people versus, and some of the very practical things have been, what if I use a 3-year rolling average for our entire organization? What if that 3-year rolling average now allows us to prioritize, donors based on their timeline and not our timeline? And we've had really authentic conversation where people want this to happen in a development role, but their organization won't support it. And then the only other thing is really, how are organizations, this is a very simple thing to do. How are you reporting your success to, say, boards or even external stakeholders? So most annual reports, top line revenue, how much money did we raise? How much money did we spend? How instead would it look if you said, these are how many people we started with, and these are how many people we ended with? Here's how we increase lifetime value. So essentially, Charlie Munger, who was Warren Buffett's business partner, always said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome, right? If our incentives are to fill the leaky bucket, we're always going to prioritize low-hanging fruit, essentially wealthier people. But if we incentivize growing and building net increases in relationships, we are incentivized to increase lifetime value, we're incentivized to increasing retention. Not to say revenue is not important. It's absolutely important. But what are you displaying back to the community first? And so these are things we didn't write about in the book because frankly, we had not had enough feedback to say, in a very practical sense, really small, but really important signals to say relationships are what are our priority, not the revenue. It's still important, but it's number 3 on the list. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Sure, that difficult problem of this is what we need to do to help the people that we're trying to help, and this is how much it's going to cost,
Right.
down to this is what, if we take a longer term perspective, if we take a relationship perspective, this is the kind of investment and this is the kind of thinking that we have to have. And maybe that means that we make less sometimes.
Right.
But in the longer term, we're making more because we're not reaching out and finding new donors all the time, which is so costly. So there's a whole, I know some of you, is it Nathan, you've got an economics background as well,
Yeah,
a little bit, yeah. So there's an economics argument that may well convince our boards. Now, I know that we're into the time for questions, but I just wanted to just reiterate what I felt was some absolutely stellar gems from what you've just said. So organisational issue. And it's not always easy for fundraisers to influence an organisational perspective. And the people who should be at this webinar, dear Lawrence, are our boards, bearing in mind that I know many of the people on here are also serving on boards. But, we need the power brokers to hear this, and we need the right kind of case. Radical connection, yes, a term that just makes us think. So working on the shoulders of the Simon Joyeux, etc., that push towards more donor-centered thinking, and but for me, I'm never quite like that. I've liked the authenticity that you talked about, the fact that it is what our organisations are about: being real, being honest, valuing that small donor as much as that large donor because of what they bring and what they make our organisation, because our organisations are not the people who work there and the building and the bricks and mortar. It's everybody. It's all the family of supporters who carry that cause. Love what you're talking about in terms of our issues with donor loyalty. Well cited, of course, 70% of people not going on to make a second gift, and your fundraising effectiveness project in the States, just trying to tackle some of those things. And of course, that relationship lens, I think, is just so important. Just to sum up just a few of the deep vein of things you were saying there. I'm going to hand over now to anybody who would like to ask questions. So if people would like to raise your hand, or if you would like to, and Lawrence, you might just need to guide me. I'm having a look here for the chat. No, yeah, so there's your chance.
No questions just yet. So why don't you continue with the good
Fabulous.
ones you've got, and then
Absolutely.
as I see them, I'll direct them to you, Wendy.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. And so I guess what I would really like to know as well is, how can those of us who are not part of Donor Search AI who have not been steeped in giving TEDx talks in these things and don't have you as a mentor directly, Nathan, how can we grow our understanding? I've seen is it Alison Fine and Beth Cantor have done some work in this space, that are very readable sort of books, but how can we skill ourselves up in this? Should we watch your TEDx talk, for instance, Nathan? Where do we go?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think everyone has probably a different lens in what they're trying to do. But to your point, there are some encouraging resources that had not existed before, and I include Ryan in that as well, as taking a glimpse of like, where are things going? Of course, Alison Fine, Beth Cantor's book, The Tech That Comes Next, is a good resource. For us, it was more about like, let's take stock of where we're at before we can imagine a new future. And there's also a lot of great reports that you're finding. I will say the last part is that our sector is very unique in the sense that you'll find always people that will help people, no matter what borders kind of are between you. And so reaching out to LinkedIn, asking a question is 100%. It's just what we do. I think that's what I learned 20 years ago when I joined the sector, and I thought it was so amazing. And we see that happening today. So, and I know there's a couple of hands raised now. So,
yeah,
certainly. So, Lawrence, did you want to?
Yeah, so there's Margaret Faulkner and there's Kristen, and I think I saw one from Paul. So let's go to Margaret first.
Thanks a lot. My question, I suppose, I really appreciate the webinar and having access to hear about everyone's ideas, and think that Wendy's done a great job of bringing it all together for Australia. My research, I'm at Ehrenberg Bass at University of South Australia, and we look at commercial as well as not-for-profits, more commercial probably. And so I agree with the small and larger donors are equally important, as Wendy has said. I suppose the thing that just my question is this radical connection. I believe we do need to treat people where they're at. They're not going to be everyone in our data points that look like they want to have a continuous connection with us. They might come in once every 2 or 3 years. So are they in your system still being supported to do that, and we meet them where they're at when they want to engage with us? Or is it back to that donor ladder pyramid thing of we're only going to sort of work with and really encourage, we want to have this radical connection? So that's probably where I was just trying to understand the takeaway of having a connection and how they want the connection, rather than how maybe we are aiming for this radical connection.
Yeah, Margaret, I think it's a great question. I'll jump in. I think the thing that I think about is some of our clients, if I were to think about their most radically connected individuals, I think some of them fit the profile you described, meaning they show up every year, every other year, every 3 years.
For a second there. Oh.
You guys hear me now? I think someone keeps putting me on mute, so I'll keep going here. Okay. I think some of the radically connected clients that we've seen, or their donors, it's a bit of meeting where they are, which is I think what you were describing. And one thing I wanted to, because some of the ones that are most radically connected, they have different characteristics, what it means to them to be radically connected. For some, it's daily contact. For others, it's a once every other year type of thing. One thing I did want to add in here, though, to try to help understand that is, what Nathan's talked about, technology, AI. I mean, it's, as we've talked about, incredibly helpful. So I don't want this to in any way, shape or form undermine that. What we were doing years ago, and still do, and when Nathan and I were talking about this in a workshop yesterday, the power of surveying, to really understand your constituents and really understand how to meet them where they are, and surveying them once a year, every 6 months, once a year, every other year, really would give you, for clients of ours who've done it, there's a great baseline of information that you can build from, and you can start to see some old-fashioned characteristics of how people are identifying or wanting to be radically connected or wanting you to meet them where they are. So just some from the food for thought there as well.
Thank you. That's great. So radical doesn't mean that sort of donor pyramid at the top like it used to in the past.
Correct.
So I think, Kristen, did you have a question as well? You have your hand
Yes.
raised?
Yep. Yes. Thanks so much. I guess with the Funding Network and a lot of the charities we support are very, very small. So the ability to some of the kind of broader thinking around donors and the data points, et cetera, is kind of far with beyond the reach. And I guess as a lot of us in Australia are dealing with that kind of the scarcity of the lack of investments in systems and infrastructure kind of over these last few years, what suggestions or ideas do you have for people that are from a much smaller, like grassroots sized charities, especially with the innovations that are happening in AI, et cetera? Where is the best place to be investing what limited resources, both financial resources, but also staffing resources to be able to have the biggest impact?
Yeah, I don't think there's a harder job in the world than running a small nonprofit. I mean, I that's how my first 7 years. I mean, I learned. I mean, I'm grateful because I learned how to do everything from writing grants to, fundraising and doing events and everything else. We had the same conversation yesterday. Brian mentioned a workshop we did with a rescue mission, and the good thing, and I'll have this from an optimistic spin, is that with the atomization of society and just this overwhelming amount of communication and all this stuff, is that we truly believe that the future of philanthropy is local, that people have an inherent sense to be connected to one another to make a difference, as from a biological sense, is that this philanthropy or generosity is a pro-social behavior, that we're meant to be called into community. And with that said, a lot of the bigger stuff's not working. So I'm a believer that people with that in the future of philanthropy being local is that people will draw closer. The scarcity mindset, though, is a significant mindset to overcome, because that's how a lot of those small nonprofits have just almost become their own worst enemy, because they're just like, oh, we just can't do anything because we don't have that scale. By the way, that scale's not working. By the way, you're local and people want to make a local difference. So those are now advantages, whereas I think they're positioned as disadvantages. The last part, and I'm a very biased and big believer in this, but the most recent advance in generative AI, so let's just name it ChatGPT or Claude or Bard or whatever you want to call it, is the most powerful level setting, bridge the digital divide ever created. And the reality is, if I was 20 years ago in my teeny little nonprofit and I had that tool, I would have had a grant writer, I would have an HR assistant, I'd have a marketing person, I would have an analyst at my disposal. So where you ask what you should, with zero barrier to entry, where you ask where you should spend your time, and I mean, literally go and watch one of the 77 million videos on YouTube on how to master ChatGPT, and don't come out of your hole or your cave for another week until you really feel good about it. You will absolutely boost and accelerate your organization in ways that were never ever possible before. So I can be I project back to when I started, and yes, I like technology. That technology is transformative for the small nonprofit.
Fantastic that we've got this kind of disruption, Kristen. Thank you very much for your question. Paul, you had
Wendy,
your question.
Yeah, Wendy, I was just going to jump in there just to help you direct the traffic. So Paul, you was next, and then we've got Nina Mullins, and then we've got Greg. So quite a few nice questions lining up there.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Nathan, was really interesting. My question has somewhat been reflected by Margaret, and I see Greg's question as well, is when a lot of the issues, and I'm a chairman of a DGR2, which is a clearinghouse to DGR1s, and often the DGR1 will say, can you give us details of the donor? And the donor says, I don't want to connect. It's nice to create an artificial intelligence persona and find out what their touch points are, but how do you get that initial connection so that, and excuse my French, and this is reflected in Greg's question, that you don't piss off the donor by saying, I've done all these social media trolls, I've found out that you like this and you're this kind of person, therefore, and we're seeing this in the insurance industry, for example, where I've just got an insurance premium hike based on my persona and hoping that I'm not going to change insurance. So how do you get that initial connection without upsetting the persona or the person you're going to?
Nathan, I'm going to let you handle that one.
Oh, really?
From a data.
Well, I mean, it's a tricky, obviously a tricky question, and there's not a one size fits all. I mean, I think, Brian, I thought you were going to share your story about the women's golf, the event, the golf event that, you know, reimagining, I'll let Brian share the story, but in my opinion, I think nonprofits have been somewhat stuck in a way of thinking like this is how we do things always. Now, Brian mentioned surveys. Surveys, like from a digital perspective and a scale perspective, surveys are amazing. You know, it's frankly not even when we data mine survey data, it actually shows it really matters much less than how they complete the survey. It's the fact that they were willing to do it, right? So then you're all, you know, skimming off the top of people who like cared enough that want to be heard, even if the sediment of the survey is somewhat critical and or constructive. So more, you know, using very free, inexpensive tools at scale to do it that way. But I think the other part, and I'll just transition it to Brian, is challenge our biases of what we think connection looks like, because you know it truly is, and this is what's been astounding since we wrote the book, and we've just had so many conversations. It's just like old habits die hard. Like you can believe in this all day long. You can think, oh yeah, it's about less is more, radical connections away. But if you go back tomorrow and you do things the same way you've always done them, you're going to be, you know, find the same result. But Brian, why don't you share some of the ideas, or at least that one?
Yeah, yeah, and I'll be quick, Paul, because I don't know if this is 100% on the point of what you're asking, because it's an example that was for a university, my alma mater. Actually, we were doing some work, and actually it connects a lot of dots here. We did a massive survey for the first time of their alumni. I'm talking, we went out to 100,000 alumni, and I think we got 6,000-7,000 responses. And one of the and nothing had to do with, at that time we knew something was up, so nothing had to do with money. We were trying to understand them as individuals, and then we started breaking down the data by different cohorts. But we designed the questions asking the development team what were some of their challenges. And one that really stood out was they said women ages 40 to 50, just according to them, dropped off the map. They weren't giving, they weren't coming to events, they weren't participating. And when the survey results came back, no surprise, that women in that cohort responded about what was important to them was their families and their health. Not you know, that was literally 1 and 2 or 2 and 1. And so we went to the board and to try to get their buy-in on this. We said it strikes us a little odd that 55% of your alumni base is female, and yet you run 35 golf outings geared at men. And so we would like to suggest that you take one golf outing away and you run a women's wellness forum, hosted by, not run by the university, hosted by the university, run by female alums for each other. And it oversubscribed 5 times. Women who they were not answering the phones or emails or doing anything were coming back in droves. And we had to actually hold the development teams back from doing the transactional thing of running in the room and asking them for their annual fund gifts. We said, let them establish connections with themselves and let them reestablish connection and importance with the university again. That's the other thing we learned, is that how many people felt that particular period of their time from 30 to 50, they found the university was of no significance to them, which couldn't be further from the truth. We were doing this survey work. It was coming out of a difficult time in the New York area. And we were able to show them that if we reminded alumni that we had career centers that could help them redo their resumes, help them with their job searches, they were finding the relevancy of the university in a totally new way. But this was just stuff we gleaned and let the data and the ahas lead us to strategy.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, it's the first derivative of the survey results. I get that. That's cool. Yeah, thank you.
So, Greg, have we kind of covered off on your question there in terms of donor fatigue? I think, and yeah, the productivity commission quote that you've got there. So if you're going down to the bottom part of that, how much of the decline in participation can be attributed to these sorts of overload experiences, donor fatigue? Will the rise of generative AI like ChatGPT see an even greater volume of contact and intense commission for connection? So if we could have a really quick, couple of sentence answer to that one, that would be great.
Yeah, used irresponsibly, it will absolutely it will overwhelm people. And I think the question is that you have to ask yourself, is sounding authentic the same as being authentic? And so keeping humans and authenticity at center is absolutely important. I believe in generative AI in terms of an efficiency tool, but do not fall in the trap that sounding authentic is the same as being authentic, and that more is better. Last year I posted on LinkedIn, I got 8.7 pounds of direct mail, and I'd only given to 5 of those organizations. So it's just, we're turning off people in droves, and this is part of the condition of what we're facing.
Interesting. And just very quickly, we have a comment from Nina, which is likewise pointing us towards better practice. So Nina is saying survey use, and we know it's useful to connect, but has it become an issue in trust that stops people engaging? It's important that they can see the data you're using is to make a connection. So yeah, that important case, I think.
Thumbs
Yep,
up.
agreed.
Yep.
Wendy,
Excellent.
there's also a question we missed from Nina Mullins asking, would you please expand on what is participation versus click rates?
Thank you.
Yeah. Did you have a response, Brian?
No, I mean, from my standpoint, participation rates, at least when I talk about them in the lens of those that are participating in engaging with the not-for-profit in, whether it be events, giving, etc. The click rates is more from more of the social standpoint, which is I think is well, Nathan could comment actually how much of a driver it is in some of the analysis. From our old school way of sort of consulting, I mean, the click rates are helpful, but I would rather much see more of that, again, more of that radical connection type of engagement versus the click-throughs, which I would consider to be a little bit more on the transactional side.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks for the questions. A few final comments before I hand back to Lawrence. Seriously an issue, folks. The data is there. We need to pay attention. How do we pay attention? You've given us some breadcrumbs to follow today, plus also the offer of LinkedIn connection, which is fabulous. I guess what you're suggesting to us is that we need to change thinking and we need to change our organisational thinking, because this is organisational level. For me, I think this should drive everybody on here. This should drive your strategic plan agenda. There should be something on this, and you need some external expertise to get this change of thinking happening. And you need some case, and I think you need some case studies, just as Brian was demonstrating there with the university alumni as a constituency. I guess that what we've learned is that there is no magic bullet here. There is a high level concept, and that it is individualized as to the organization as to how you achieve this radical connection. And we need to be talking to people. Yay, there's something that we in fundraising know how to do. I guess I would also be looking to our organisations to put a budget in to at least start to address this, and maybe you do it as an innovation and something that can fail, but something that allows us to trial a different approach around the relationship lens rather than just the dollar lens. And are there more creative ways that we can find those dollars? I guess I can't read my last point. So that tells me I should be finishing.
That was great, Wendy. No, that was great. Thank you.
Really enjoyed the chat, really enjoyed the comments from everyone around. And I think it's a taster. I think there's a lot more to be said here. And I think this is something that our conferences, our strategic conferences for our peak bodies should really be having a good look at. But I'd also go buy the book for your chairs and for your boards and your CEOs would be one other thought that I would have. Lawrence, thank you so much.
Look, thank you all. Such a rich conversation in so limited time, and I know we need to end in a moment. So just before I, hand to Kristen to give a vote of thanks, let me just say, when I first broached the idea of this forum with Nathan, we, discussed a bit whether we start with this, which, neatly presents a synopsis of the book, or at least gives an overview, or we dive into responsible, fundraising AI, obviously an enormous and really important topic, and, something that we are discussing. So thinking out loud, I might ask this forum for some thoughts and feedback on interest on that. We don't think we could do that, in a short session like this. It'd probably be a workshop. Virtual or in person would be better. Long way to come, but perhaps in stages. So we'll ask you that. We do share the recordings of this, as you know, so we will do that as usual. And we'd love to hear participant user group thoughts, suggestions, feedback on where we might kind of go with this and what will be useful to you. But in the interest of time, let me hand to Kristen to give a vote of thanks on our collective behalf.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of everyone who joined us today, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and your insights. I know I, for one, and probably everyone on this call has some really tangible things that we can take away to make happen. I think, that the concept of radical connection and really looking at what that means for each organization and how you can bring that to life is going to be something that I'm going to really take away from that. I'm excited that we actually have a team brainstorm in an hour's time that I know I'll be kicking off with pushing the team to be thinking about that. And so on behalf of all of us who will take so much of these learnings and I know be ordering the book, hopefully you'll see a big spike in sales in the coming weeks. But thank you so much for your time and insights. I appreciate this forum and the ability to come together and hear great ideas that really, as you say, where we might have started at a low point can really finish on a high point with some excitement and enthusiasm to take us through the day. So Lawrence, thank you so much to you and the team for bringing these together and giving us this opportunity and a forum to really connect with like-minded people who share our passion, thoughts and frustrations, but at the same time, always giving us something that we can take away and put into place, into practice in our organizations right now. So thank you.
My pleasure, and thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wendy, thank you very much. Really
Yeah,
appreciate your time and usual guidance and immense help.
Lawrence, was a really great session, and Ella, nice to see you too. I thought it was a really charge up kind of session. So yeah, some more steps would be great. But you have a great day, guys. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye, everybody.